Chapter 1. Definition and importance of economic history. Firstly, definition of economic history. Economic history is an academic discipline that seeks to understand and explain humanity's economic activities and their changes over time. It encompasses the systematic study of global economic events, processes, and transformations that have occurred across various societies and regions throughout history. At its core, economic history explores how societies have organized their economic systems, allocated resources, and generated wealth over centuries. The discipline traces its roots to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars began applying historical methods and economic analysis to study past economic developments. Economic historians employ a multidisciplinary approach, integrating insights from economics, history, sociology, political science, and cultural studies to unravel the complex interactions between economic factors and broader societal forces. Key aspects of economic history include a study of economic events. Economic historians examine significant economic events such as industrial revolutions, financial crises, depressions, and periods of economic growth. By analyzing these events, they seek to identify underlying causes, economic policies, technological advancements, and societal changes that contributed to economic outcomes. B. Analysis of economic processes. The discipline investigates long-term economic processes such as urbanization, demographic changes, technological innovation, and globalization. It explores how these processes have shaped economic structures, market dynamics, and patterns of production and consumption over time. C. Causal relationships. Economic history aims to uncover causal relationships between economic variables and outcomes. Scholars use quantitative methods, statistical analysis, and econometric modeling, alongside qualitative historical research to discern patterns and trends in economic development. D. Comparative and cross-national studies. Economic historians conduct comparative studies across different countries and regions to understand variations in economic performance, institutions, and policies. Comparative analysis allows for insights into the impact of cultural, political, and institutional factors on economic outcomes. E. Policy relevance. Insights from economic history inform contemporary economic policymaking and decision-making. Policymakers draw on historical precedents to design effective policies for economic development, regulation, taxation, and social welfare. Lessons learned from past successes and failures guide efforts to address current economic challenges and promote sustainable growth. Interdisciplinary approach. Economic history integrates perspectives from multiple disciplines to provide a comprehensive understanding of economic phenomena. It considers the interplay between economic factors, social structures, cultural norms, and political institutions in shaping economic behavior and outcomes. Key long-term perspective. Unlike conventional economic analysis that often focuses on short-term trends, economic history adopts a long-term perspective. By examining economic developments over centuries, it reveals patterns of continuity, change, and adaptation in response to technological, environmental, and geopolitical shifts. Overall, economic history serves as a critical tool for understanding the complexities of economic systems, informing policy decisions, and enriching our understanding of how societies have navigated economic challenges and opportunities throughout history. It offers valuable insights into the factors driving economic growth, inequality, technological progress, and global economic integration. By studying economic history, Scholars and policymakers alike gain a deeper appreciation of the dynamics shaping the world economy and are better equipped to address contemporary economic issues in a global context. Secondly, importance of economic history. Economic history is an academic discipline that studies and explains humanity's economic activities and their changes over time. This field encompasses various academic backgrounds such as economics, history, social sciences, and cultural studies to analyze global economic events and processes that have occurred worldwide. Economic history focuses on understanding both past and current economic conditions and predicting future economic trends. It supports governments, businesses, academia, and other decision makers in effectively developing economic policies and making informed decisions.
Complex, well-oiled machine with absolutely no faults. But have you ever questioned why the global economy is the global economy? Why do we have a world of globalization? And how did we go from a society of trading goats to the average person not being able to afford a one-bedroom condo in Toronto? Well, this is the history of globalization and everything you will need to know about the history of the global economy and potentially its incoming collapse. So let's start off with antiquity. The time when humans decided that merely hunting and gathering was just a little too easy. So they settled down, they started farming, and unintentionally laid the foundation for globalization. This was called the Neolithic Revolution, the era when humans thought, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to move around so much? Thus, agriculture was born, and with it, the seeds, pun intended, of global trade. Around 10,000 BC, in a stroke of genius or sheer laziness, humans began farming in the Fertile Crescent, a region that sounds a lot more comfortable than it actually was. This region, covering parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, became the first to host large-scale agriculture. Grains like wheat and barley were domesticated, leading to a surplus of food and consequently the first economic boom. Now, this surplus allowed people to do other things other than farming. So they did things like invent pottery and weaving and, most importantly, figuring out new ways to annoy their neighbors. Now, they did this because when you have more grain than you can eat, you can trade it for shiny objects, and before you know it, you've got yourself an economy. Now, with surplus food came the need to trade, because who wouldn't want to swap their extra grain for some pretty beads or some nice obsidian? Trade routes sprang up, linking villages and eventually early cities. By 6000 BC, long-distance trade networks had formed with luxury items like lapis lazuli, traveling all the way from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia. Little did they know this was setting the groundwork for long-distance trade, or what we now know today as ordering something from Amazon. Fast forward to around 3500 BC, and we have the rise of the first economic superpowers. They were Mesopotamia and Egypt. These civilizations weren't just farming anymore. They were building cities, inventing writing systems, and constructing monuments to remind future generations that they were indeed a big deal. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians developed one of the earliest forms of writing, cuneiform, which, surprise, surprise, was used to keep track of trade and inventory. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the pharaohs were busy building pyramids and establishing trade networks that reached as far as the Levant and Nubia. The Nile River was their highway, and they used it to transport goods like gold, papyrus, and linen. By 3000 BC, we enter something called the Bronze Age, named for the new metal alloy that everyone suddenly couldn't really live without. The smartphone of its day, if you will. Bronze, made from copper and tin, was stronger and more durable than the previous metals, making it ideal for tools, weapons, and just showing off your technology and wealth. This technological leap forward allowed civilizations to expand their influence even further. The Minoans in Crete, for example, became maritime traders, spreading their influence across the Aegean Sea. They traded goods like pottery, olive oil, and wine with neighboring regions, helping lay the groundwork for the interconnected Mediterranean world. With all of this trade and technological advancement, you'd think that everyone was just living the high life. But no, most people were still toiling away in the fields or working as artisans. The concept of a middle class was, at best, a dream. So when we talk about the wealth generated by trade, that largely ended up in the hands of the elite, who used it to build grand palaces and fund lavish lifestyles that we can in some cases still see with our eyes today. Take the palace at Knossos, for example, on the island of Crete. But hey, it wasn't all bad. These early civilizations did establish the foundations of economic systems, creating the first markets and formalizing trade practices. They also invented money, or at least the precursor to money, in the form of standardized weights and measures, which made trading a bit more straightforward and less reliant on bartering your goat for your neighbor's grain. But now we enter the classical era, let's call it. This was where things get a little bit more sophisticated and a lot more imperial, but also exponentially more connected. So let's picture this. Vast empires stretching their tendrils across continents, monumental trade routes, and the not-so-subtle art of acquiring spices. This period saw the rise of some of the greatest civilizations in history, all keen on showing off their wealth, power, and ability to build really big walls. So let's start off with Mesopotamia, something we mentioned earlier. This was where the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians took turns outdoing each other in their empire building. These civilizations perfected the art of administration. They created complex bureaucracies to manage their vast empires. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length, laid down laws that governed trade, amongst other things, ensuring that everyone knew exactly how much trouble they'd be in for cheating on their business partners. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the pharaohs continued to rule over their kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in a gold leaf. The New Kingdom period of Egypt from 1550 BC to about 1077 BC saw Egypt become a veritable powerhouse, trading extensively with its neighbors and beyond. They imported things like cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, and exotic goods from as far as Punt, also known as modern-day Somalia and Eritrea. Now fast forward a little bit and going to the other side of the Mediterranean, we find the Greeks. They were the ones who pretty much turned trade into its first art form. By 800 BC, the Greek city-states were busy establishing colonies around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, creating a network of trade that linked them to every corner of the known world. The Greeks traded olive oil, wine, and pottery for grain, metals, and luxury items, spreading their influence and culture far and wide.
형준이가 늘 그랬어요. 엄마, 저 사람이 예수님일 줄 몰라. 가장 보잘것없이 찾아오는 그 모습.
Fast forward just a few hundred more years, we have Alexander the Great. And he had this great idea that he totally thought of, which was he is going to globalize the economy by conquering everything from Greece to India. His conquest created the Hellenistic world, a fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that established new trade routes and economic systems. The Silk Road, which became a trade route between the East and the West, saw an influx of goods like silk, spices, and precious stones flowing into the Hellenistic cities. But then we move a little bit more forward, and by the 1st century BC, Rome had transformed from a small city-state to a sprawling empire that encircled the Mediterranean, which they fondly referred to as Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. The Romans were masters of engineering. They were building roads that connected the empire and facilitated trade like never before. These roads weren't just for marching legions, they were highways of commerce, enabling the flow of goods, ideas, and culture. Now, Roman trade was extensive. They imported silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and amber from the Baltic. The Roman economy was diverse, with a complex system of currency that made trade easier. They even had a rudimentary banking system, with merchants using letters of credit to conduct transactions over long distances, an idea that we still use today. Fun. Now, speaking of the Silk Road, let's give it a little bit of a spotlight here. This network of trade routes established during the Han Dynasty during 206 BC to 220 AD stretched from China to the Mediterranean, passing through Central Asia, India, Persia, and the Middle East. Now, it wasn't just silk that traveled these routes. Spices, precious metals, artworks, and even ideas made the long journey. The Silk Road was the ancient equivalent of the internet, connecting distant civilizations in a web of commerce and culture. China, under the Han Dynasty, became an economic powerhouse, exporting silk, tea, and ceramics. In return, they received horses, glassware, and various luxury items from the West. And this exchange wasn't just limited to goods. It also included technology, religion, and even disease. Buddhism, for instance, spread from India to China along these trade routes, while the bubonic plague made its unwelcome debut a few centuries later. Now, during this era, the concept of the middle class began to take shape, albeit in a rudimentary form. Rome, for instance, was a class of plebeians, meaning free citizens who weren't patricians, but had some wealth and some influence. These individuals were often merchants, artisans, and traders who benefited from the extensive trade networks of the empire. During this time, economic systems also evolved, with various forms of currency being used to facilitate trade. The Greeks used silver drachmas, the Romans used their denarii, and the Chinese minted coins with square holes in the middle, making them easy to string together and carry. These currencies helped standardize trade and reduce the reliance on bartering. And so, as you can see, during this era, globalization was beginning to take root around the world. But now we will move on to the next era. Some call it the Middle Ages, and others call it the Dark Ages. Now, sure, yes, we've all heard about the plagues, the Crusades, and a feudal system that made social mobility about as likely as finding a Wi-Fi signal in the Sahara Desert. But this period also saw significant advancements in trade, exploration, and yes, globalization. We begin in the fallout of the fall of the Roman Empire, around 500 AD, when Europe decided to take a breather from building empires and focus more on some local issues. Now, this led to a rise in feudalism, a system where everyone knew their place, lords owned the land, vassals swore loyalty, and peasants worked the fields. While this might seem like a recipe for isolation, it actually laid the groundwork for localized trade networks, and also laid the groundwork for what's kind of happening today in the modern society, but we'll get to that later. In these early days, most trade was local, with goods like grain, wool, and timber being exchanged between neighboring villages. However, some luxury items, such as silks and spices, although these keep coming up in pretty much every single era, they still managed to trickle in from distant lands, carried by daring merchants who braved bandits and bad roads to make a profit. While Europe was busy with its feudal shenanigans, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age. From the 8th century to the 14th century, the Islamic caliphates, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate, became the epicenters of trade, science, and culture of the world. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were not just political capitals, but also bustling trade hubs where goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe converged. The Islamic world at the time was instrumental to expanding and reviving these ancient trade routes. They improved on the Silk Road, making it more efficient and safer for traders. Merchants from the Islamic world traded spices, textiles, and precious metals, and in return, they imported furs, slaves, and amber from Northern Europe. They also introduced new agricultural techniques and crops like rice and sugar to the Mediterranean basin, further boosting economic growth. But also during this time, there was something called the Crusades. Those delightful military expeditions where European knights went to the Holy Land to fight for God and accidentally rediscovered the joys of Eastern luxury. Starting in 1096, the Crusades were a series of religious wars aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. While they failed in their primary objective, they succeeded spectacularly in opening up new trade routes and exposing Europeans to these exotic goods. Returning crusaders brought back spices, silks, and other luxuries, sparking a demand for these back home. This demand led to increased trade between Europe and the East, with Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa emerging as major trading powers. They're also amongst my favorite countries to play as in the game Europa Universalis 4 if you ever get interested in this time period. Now, these cities became wealthy by acting as intermediaries, ferrying goods between the Muslim world and the rest of Europe. But now, in walks in the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, a massive empire that stretched from Europe to Asia. It did this under the leadership of Genghis or Genghis Khan and his successors. Now, the Mongols created the largest contiguous empire in history, and more importantly for our story, they reopened and secured the Silk Road. The Pax Mongolica, also known as the Mongol Peace, ensured that trade routes were safe and that merchants could travel from one end of the empire to the other with relative ease. And yes, there is irony of there was peace in the trade routes of the Mongol Empire, but there really wasn't peace anywhere else the Mongols went during this time. But the Mongols facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between the East and the West. For instance, Chinese innovations like gunpowder, the compass, and printing made their way to Europe, while European goods and ideas traveled eastward. This period saw a significant increase in global trade, with caravans and merchant ships ferrying goods across vast distances. Speaking of traveling long distances, we cannot forget to mention Marco Polo. No, that is not just a game that kids play, it is an actual person in history. He is a Venetian merchant who traveled to China in the late 13th century and lived to tell the tale. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, became a bestseller, at least by medieval standards, and sparked European interest in the riches of the East. Polo's accounts of the wealth and splendor of the Mongol court and the cities of China made European merchants and monarchs eager to find direct trade routes to Asia. And this would become important as a future explorer might become a little bit lost trying to find a route to Asia and end up somewhere else in the world. So we'll get to that after. As we move into the late Middle Ages, around the 14th and 15th centuries, trade networks in Europe became more sophisticated. The Hanseatic League, a commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northwestern and central Europe, they dominated trade along the coast of northern Europe. The League controlled the trade of goods like grain, timber, and fish, ensuring that their members profited handsomely from these commodities. At the same time, the Italian city-states continued to thrive, becoming centers of finance and trade. Venice, in particular, became a major player, controlling key trade routes in the Mediterranean and establishing colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The wealth generated from the trade helped fund the Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual movement that would shape the future of Europe. During the Middle Ages, economic systems became more complex. Feudalism remained the dominant system in rural areas, but cities began to develop more diversified economies. Guilds associated with craftsmen and merchants regulated trade and ensured quality control while also providing social support for their members. The middle class, or the bourgeoisie, began to emerge more prominently during this period. These individuals, who were not nobles but had acquired wealth through trade, commerce, and craftsmanship, they played a crucial role in the urban economy, investing in businesses, sponsoring exploration, and even influencing political decisions, something that never happens today, ever. And so the Middle Ages were a time of expansion of globalization. Those seeds that were planted from the Roman Empire, they were already sprouting and growing during the Middle Ages. But now we move on to the next age, which is the age of exploration. This was the age when European nations decided that staying within their borders was kind of boring, and that the real fun lay in sailing across uncharted waters to find new lands, riches, and people to exploit. This period, spanning from the 15th to 18th century, saw the dawn of global empires, the discovery of new continents, and a level of maritime enthusiasm that would make Captain Jack Sparrow proud. So let's start off with Portugal, shall we? A small nation with big maritime ambitions. In the 15th century, the Portuguese, under Prince Henry, the navigator's sponsorship, embarked on a series of voyages along the West African coast. They were in search of gold, but they soon realized that spices from the east were the real gold mine. In 1498, Vasco da Gama made it to India, opening up a sea route that bypassed the overland routes dominated by the Muslim traders. This achievement was monumental. It allowed the Portuguese to establish a direct trade link with India, thereby cornering the spice trade. Pepper, cinnamon, and other exotic spices flowed into Europe, fetching high prices, making Portugal incredibly wealthy. Now, not to be outdone, Spain threw its hat into the exploration ring. 1492, Christopher Columbus, backed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, set sail westward in search of a new route to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon the Americas, although he died believing that he indeed did find a shortcut to India. But Spain quickly capitalized on Columbus's discovery, sending conquistadors to claim vast territories in the New World. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, and Francisco Pizarro toppled the Inca Empire in Peru. These conquests brought immense wealth to Spain, particularly in the form of silver and gold, and turned it into the 16th century equivalent of a global superpower. Now, the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas triggered the Columbian Exchange, which was a massive transfer of goods, people, plants, and animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World. Europe sent horses, cattle, pigs, and wheat across the Atlantic, while the Americas contributed tomatoes, potatoes, maize, and somewhat less positively, syphilis. This exchange had profound effects on global economies and diets. Potatoes and maize became staple crops in Europe and Asia, significantly boosting population growth. Meanwhile, European livestock transformed agriculture in the Americas. Downside, European diseases like smallpox decimated indigenous populations, paving the way for European colonization. Now, the age of exploration gave a rise to mercantilism, an economic system that emphasized the accumulation of wealth through trade, especially the accumulation of precious metals. European powers believed that the wealth of a nation was finite, so the goal was to amass as much gold and silver as possible. This led to the establishment of colonies, which served as sources of raw materials and markets of manufactured goods. Colonies were essential to the mercantilist system. They provided resources like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, which were shipped back to Europe, processed, and then sent back to the colonies or other markets. The Navigation Acts in England and similar policies in other countries ensured that trade benefited the mother country, reinforcing the idea that colonies existed solely for the economic benefit of their European overlords. And in the future, one of these colonies did not like that idea, and we will get to that shortly. While Spain and Portugal were busy carving up the New World, the Dutch decided to get in on the action with a slightly different approach. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was the world's first multinational corporation and the first company to issue stock. It became a dominant force in global trade, particularly in the spice trade in Southeast Asia. The Dutch established trading posts and colonies in Indonesia, South Africa, and the Americas, focusing on commerce rather than outright conquest. Their innovative use of joint stock companies and financial instruments like bonds laid the groundwork for modern-day capitalism. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, became the world's first official stock exchange, further cementing the Dutch Republic as a financial powerhouse. The British, initially slow off the mark, soon caught up with their European rivals. They established colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and India following the mercantilist playbook. The British East India Company, founded in 1600, became a powerful entity, controlling vast territories in India and establishing a lucrative trade network. The 18th century saw Britain emerge as the dominant global power, thanks in part to its naval superiority. The Royal Navy protected British trade routes and colonies, ensuring that goods like sugar, tea, and textiles flowed into British ports. The age of exploration and the subsequent rise of global trade had a significant impact on social structures. In Europe, the wealth generated from trade and colonization led to the growth of the middle class, particularly merchants, bankers, and investors who profited from the new economic opportunities. During the time economic systems became more complex and sophisticated, joint stock companies allowed for the pooling of capital and shared risk, leading to large-scale ventures that individual investors couldn't undertake alone. Banking systems evolved to support these enterprises, with institutions like the Bank of England, founded in 1694, providing stability and credit. But now we move on to the Industrial Revolution and the age of imperialism, where the world witnessed unprecedented technological advancements, the rise of global industries, and a frantic race among European powers to carve up every inch of the planet not yet claimed. So as already mentioned, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 18th century and quickly spread through Europe and North America. It was marked by a series of technological innovations that revolutionized manufacturing, transportation, and communication. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the 1770s, powered factories, ships, and locomotives, driving industrial growth and creating new possibilities for global trade. Factories sprang up, producing goods at an unprecedented scale. Textile manufacturing was among the first industries to be transformed, with the spinning jenny, power loom, and cotton gin increasing production and efficiency. This led to the growth of industrial cities, where workers toiled in factories under often brutal conditions. The development of railroads and steamships shrank the world, making it possible to transport goods and people faster and more efficiently. The first public railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in England in 1825, followed by the first intercity railway, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, in 1830. These innovations spread worldwide, with rail networks crisscrossing Europe, North America, and eventually other continents. Steamships revolutionized maritime trade. The SS Great Western, launched in 1838, was one of the first steam-powered ships capable of crossing the Atlantic. This technological leap allowed for more reliable and faster transportation of goods, reducing shipping times and costs along the way. The Suez Canal opened in 1869 and the Panama Canal opened in 1914. They further facilitated global trade by providing shorter sea routes. Now, the Industrial Revolution gave birth to industrial giants, companies, and entrepreneurs who amassed enormous wealth and power. And now enter the United States. After disliking being a British colony, they turned into their own nation just 150 years before, and then they gave rise to figures like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance. Their corporations dominated key sectors, driving economic growth and influencing national and international policies. In Europe, companies like Krupp in Germany, known for its steel production, and the British East India Company, which had evolved into a powerful economic and political entity in India, played significant roles. These industrial giants not only fueled economic expansion, but also reinforced the interconnectedness of global markets. While industrialization was transforming economies, European powers were busy expanding their empires. The 19th century saw the height of imperialism, with European nations competing to colonize vast territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. This period, known as the Scramble for Africa, was driven by economic, political, and social factors. The Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers carved up Africa without a single African representative present, epitomized the era's imperial ambitions. By 1914, nearly the entire continent was under European control. Britain and France emerged as the dominant colonial powers with extensive territories in Africa and Asia. Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Portugal also claimed significant portions of Africa. Colonial powers exploited their colonies for economic gain, extracting raw materials and agricultural products to feed their industrial economies. Rubber from the Congo, diamonds from South Africa, tea from India, and spices from Southeast Asia flowed into European markets, enriching colonial powers while often devastating local economies and societies. At the same time, colonial rulers invested in infrastructure to facilitate extraction and control. Railways, ports, and telegraph lines were built connecting colonies to imperial centers. While these developments improved transportation and communication, they primarily served colonial interests and reinforced the exploitative economic relationships between colonies and their rulers. The Industrial Revolution and imperial expansion led to the growth of the middle class in industrialized nations. Merchants, industrialists, and professionals benefited from economic growth, enjoying improved standards of living and greater social mobility. The burgeoning middle class played a crucial role in shaping political and economic policies. However, industrialization also brought about it harsh working conditions and economic inequality. Labor movements emerged, advocating for workers' rights, better wages, and safer working conditions. The rise of trade unions and socialist movements in Europe and the United States reflected growing discontent with industrial capitalism and its social impacts. The 19th century saw entrenchment of capitalism as the dominant economic system in the Western world. Free markets, private property, and competition were seen as engines of economic growth. However, the negative impacts of unregulated capitalism, such as worker exploitation and economic inequality, led for calls to reform. In response, various economic theories and systems emerged. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, criticizing capitalism and advocating for a classless, socialist society. While Marxist ideas gained traction among some intellectuals and workers, capitalism remained the prevailing system, albeit with increasing government intervention and regulation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But now we enter the 20th and 21st centuries, a time when you can argue that humanity was both at its best and its worst. Now, the 20th century kicked off with the cataclysmic impact of World War I. A conflict so vast it was dubbed the War to End All Wars. And spoiler, it didn't. The war involved nations from around the world and ended with significant geopolitical changes, including the collapse of empires and the redrawing of borders, particularly in Europe and the Middle East. World War II further reshaped the global order with even more devastating consequences. The war's end marked the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the superpowers of the world and ushered in the Cold War era. The economic and political fallout from the wars accelerated decolonization as European powers, weakened by war, could no longer maintain their overseas empires. But the Cold War divided much of the world into two major economic and political blocs: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This period was characterized by political tensions, nuclear arms races, and proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Economically, the Cold War era saw the establishment of institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which were designed to stabilize the global economy and prevent future conflicts. And congratulations, they did their job, because we have not had a single conflict since the 1940s. The European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, was founded in 1957 to foster economic cooperation and integration among European nations. And fast forward a little bit to the late 20th century, where we witnessed the digital revolution, which fundamentally changed how people live, work, and communicate. The invention of the personal computer, the rise of the internet, and the proliferation of mobile technology have created a global village connecting people across continents in real time. The digital age, which we are living through right now, has also transformed the global economy. Companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, now Meta, have become global entities that influence culture and economies around the world. E-commerce and digital finance have redefined trade and banking, making it easier to buy, sell, and invest across borders. The late 20th century and early 21st centuries have been marked by increased economic globalization. The establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995 and the proliferation of free trade agreements have led to lower trade barriers and more integrated global markets. However, globalization has also sparked debates about inequality and the environment. Critics argue that while free trade has increased wealth, it has also exacerbated income disparities and contributed to environmental degradation. In fact, the anti-globalization movement gained momentum in the late 1990s, highlighting these issues and pushing for more sustainable and equitable economic practices. Now, the 21st century and the rise of globalization has also seen the rise of emerging economies such as China, India, and Brazil. China's economic ascent has been particularly notable, transitioning from a closed, centrally planned system to a major player in the global market. By 2020, China was the world's second largest economy, playing a crucial role in global supply chains and international politics. Now, as economies have globalized, a global middle class has emerged, particularly in Asia. This new middle class has increased demand for consumer goods, higher education, and international travel, contributing to a cultural exchange and global interconnectedness. Cultural globalization has also led to the spread of English, along with the global influence of American and Western pop culture, although this has led to the concerns of cultural homogenization and the loss of indigenous traditions and languages across the world. But now, as we keep moving forward into the 21st century, globalization faces new challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic, which started in 2020, exposed the vulnerabilities of interconnected global systems, leading to discussions about the need for greater resilience in supply chains and international cooperation. Additionally, the rise of nationalism and protectionism in several countries poses challenges to the ideals of open markets and free trade. But now let's look into the crystal ball and peer into the murky waters of the future, where the global economy is likely to face a myriad of troubles. So let's start off with geopolitical tensions, shall we? From trade wars to actual wars, the global economy is constantly at the mercy of political maneuvering and conflict. The rivalry between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies, is a prime example. Trade disputes, technological competition, and military posturing between these giants have the potential to disrupt global supply chains and markets. Other geopolitical hotspots, such as the Middle East, the Korean Peninsula, and Eastern Europe, continue to simmer. These tensions can lead to economic sanctions, trade barriers, and market instability, all of which hinder economic growth. And because of this increasing globalization, we are now at a point where something could happen 10,000 kilometers away, and it could increase the price of something you buy every day by 200%. And another thing that is also happening because of this globalization is an increase in inequality. As multinational corporations continue to grow, they'll get even more powerful. They'll continue to consolidate wealth and power, leaving small businesses and workers in the dust, even if it's in their home country. And again, because of all of this globalization, there are tons of corporations that don't keep any of their money in the same country where they make the money. Apple is a good example. They make their money largely in the United States and put it all to Ireland. Another thing that's happening is the robots are coming and they're gunning for your job. So thanks to globalization, companies will continue to seek out cheaper labor markets and invest in automation to cut costs. Meaning you could have a local job in New York, but if some AI robot in Shenzhen does your job better than you, that company is probably going to move their job to Shenzhen. But there's also a lot of future benefits of globalization. I mean, we all get to share technology and culture. I mean, a lot of you watching this video probably are not from Canada, yet I am from Canada. And the only reason why I can even make this video is because we have a globalized technology in the internet. So going forward, maybe it'll keep ramping up with artificial intelligence, and maybe we have some sort of future utopia. I am not quite sure. But anyways, I think that's going to wrap this video up for now. I have a few more things I'd like to talk about with this, but we'll save it for another time. And if you liked this video, this new format, or the new visuals, just please leave a comment down below and leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Make sure to click on my documentaries playlist if you did enjoy this video. So just click on that. And I'll see you guys in my next video in just a few seconds. Thank you.
Take a right hand, shake it out. How many people here want to learn faster?